Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for ISACA's webcast, Real World Ransomware Attacks. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that collectively we work and live on treaty lands. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Our own ISACA-Winnipeg Board Member, Kyle Molotkin, will present today on Real World Ransomware Attacks. As President and Chief Executive Officer of Informanix, his firm was called in to assist with several major ransomware attacks in Winnipeg. Kyle will share insights about attack vectors, response strategies, what actually happens with internal IT staff, and even negotiations with attackers. I know this would be an excellent presentation today and very informative. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will get to as many as possible. Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, Val. My name is Kyle Molotkin. I'm the President and CEO for Informanix Technology Group. Been in the IT game for a little while now, focusing mostly on information security and assurance, infrastructure and architecture, governance, PM type work. As a bonus, I've been on the board of ISACA-Winnipeg for almost a decade, and I've been on the Western Canada Information Security Conference Committee since 2006. Informanix Technology Group, we founded in 2013. We have three kind of business units: consulting, which is just advisory and enterprise risk type stuff, project management work, enterprise infrastructure, focusing on data center, compute, storage, cloud, security, that type of work. And our managed services division is full lifecycle IT outsourcing. So let's talk about what we are going to get into today. I have three case studies from three Winnipeg-based ransom attacks. Myself personally, I was involved in the first responder actions for all of these, the remediation for all of these, and the investigation that went at the end. I've altered some of the non-material facts just to keep the victim identities confidential. So what I hope that people on the webcast will get out of this is we're going to highlight the fundamental architecture failures that were present in all of these cases. Control failures, we'll talk about some of the precursor and early warning indicators, things that you could be watching for. We'll dive into a little bit of the HR and operational aspects, and hopefully give you some key points that you can use to look at your own environment through a different lens. So I think it was, actually didn't have this slide originally, and I decided to put it in just in case somebody doesn't know what ransomware is. I think it is worth recapping. So really the availability of untraceable crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum, there's tons, is given the ability for people to actually take payments. So traditionally, if you were going to do something like this and exploit somebody and you had to like wire the money through a traditional wire transfer, you could trace who's getting that money, and really it kind of falls down. So because you have untraceable currency, ransomware is a huge industry. At the core of it, it's really just malicious software that runs and encrypts files, just the same way you might encrypt a file if you wanted to securely email it to somebody over the internet. The big difference being is the attacker is the one that has the decrypt key, and then they want a ransom payment in order to give you that key. As recently as 3 or 4 years ago, the actual ask for ransom payments were quite insignificant. $500, $1,000, and a lot of companies found it was easier to just pay the ransom and be done with it, and then to actually go through the recovery effort. However, insurance coverage has become widely available for exploitation risk and has caused the payment demands to explode. We're seeing a lot of ransom asks now well into the 7 and 8 figures. So the insurance company trying to actually cover those $1,000 payments has actually made the problem worse, in my opinion. The ransomware software itself has also gotten a lot more complicated and advanced. And there's a whole new market of what I call compromise as a service vendors that are out there that are just breaking into networks and not actually doing anything with them other than selling access to those networks for the more lazy ransomware attacker. Just buy something and you're good to go. So that's ransomware. Let's talk about, we'll dive into some scenarios. Scenario number one is a 2,000 user manufacturing company with 25 locations. There's 500 virtual machine workloads in 9 data centers. Pre-attack architecture, the wide area network, the WAN, was entirely unrestricted. Once you were past a firewall at any one of the locations, you can move freely between locations. They were using legacy signature-based antivirus. They had no security operations center, and there was a significant use of Samba version 1 and Server 2003, both of which are extremely legacy. They did have air-gapped backups, which is, as you'll hear, a recurring theme from me today about air-gapped backups. Precursor events. So there's the event day, and then I call precursor events anything that's pre-event day. So in this case, there was 10 days of precursor activity. There was 2 locations that had some ransomware on it, and it was stopped. Computers were wiped. It was a garden variety ransom payload, so really just off the shelf, nothing too special. It was easily detected. Machines were wiped. And then a few days later, ransomware returned to these 2 locations. Same cleanup process. Life went on. This should have been the early warning indicator that perhaps why did it come back the second time? There's obviously some persistent threats going on. Nevertheless, we got into actual event day. Boom, 70 terabytes of data were encrypted. A complete outage. The entire business was shut down and at a total standstill. There was a ransom note demanding 10 million Canadian dollars worth of Bitcoin at the time. Those same Bitcoins are worth a lot more now if you're a Bitcoin trader. So that's when we got involved. First order of business, as the call came in, encryption activity was still happening. And the only reason it was only 70 terabytes is because literally told people to run into every server room and wiring closet and pull the power. Don't do any graceful shutdowns, nothing. Yank the power cord out of the back and we'll deal with it after. We had to investigate each host and each VM one at a time in isolation. This is a pretty laborious process. Boot it up offline, see if it's infected, build a list of what's infected. We established and confirmed a cleanup process. We confirmed a backup integrity. In a parallel stream, the legal department of the customer was engaging with the attacker to pursue a payment possibility, just as a backup in case our actual backups didn't work. We established a command team, and there was about 100 plus people actually involved with the recovery effort. We implemented a cleanup process, or we would just blow a machine away. And I can tell you that you have no idea how many endpoints 2,000 is until you have to touch each single one by hand with a USB key one at a time. Thankfully, we had a large number of, an army of people walking around with USB keys deploying security software. And then we began the long process of restoring for backup. In this particular scenario, the restores of the workloads took over 120 days, because while the backup environment was properly air gapped and was actually pretty decently designed, it never actually took into consideration the need to restore everything at once. If you needed to restore a single file or a single VM, it worked well. Restoring your entire environment from backup was a very, very long job. So what actually happened here? A program called Emotet, also sent out by the same group called Emotet, was installed with an email downloader. So more than likely, and we don't have the evidence of this because it was, the mail server was destroyed, but There's some indication that it was a user that clicked on a phishing email, ran some macro-enabled script. Emotet is actually a compromise as a service vendor, and they sell access to compromised networks in the black market. So in this particular case, Emotet came in one of the facilities, and it started leveraging the open WAN architecture and taking advantage of Eternal Blue, which was on a bunch of unpatched Windows 7 machines. And they just started collecting hosts. And they started reporting that host count to the black market. So this is, in our opinion, what explained the amateur ransom attacks. So somebody bought early access. Oh, this looks like a 14-person company. So it's just some guy sitting in his basement who decided, I'll take an attempt at this. That was stopped. Again, round 2 with the amateur our attack in the precursor period. Same thing as it threw. Once Emotet got to a sizable amount, a group called RIAC bought access, and these guys are the big boys. So they said, move out of the way, rookies, we got it from here. They customized their payload. They actually got their payload established using the Emotet access all over the environment, and then detonated everything all at once on event day. The encryption activity started about 2 in the morning and wasn't detected till 6 a.m. And it encrypted 70 terabytes of data in that time. Both Emotet and RIAC just simply asked the legacy antivirus to turn off, and it disabled its own service. So these folks thought they had adequate antivirus protection, and it would have been easier to have nothing because there would be less administration. So let's talk about some key takeaways from this scenario. Internal staff politics reached a boiling point at one point. There was almost a fist fight as different groups are arguing with one another during the recovery, and there's conflicting opinions, and some people harbor some bad blood and blame others for things. It was very, very interesting to see. There were significant communications issues. So these folks had an on-premise email infrastructure, and internal communications were pretty much disabled. Nobody knew anyone's phone numbers because they're used to looking them up in email signatures. So we had to just get people to tell us their cell phone numbers, and we had a big whiteboard in the command room. People were using their personal addresses, or we spun up Gmail addresses for those who didn't have personal addresses. And then really from a project management standpoint, everything that you'd use to collaborate on, we had a big couple spreadsheets of status of different servers and machines and things, all that type of stuff that you would normally put on a file server or other collaboration space doesn't exist. So you got to think outside the box on how you're actually going to coordinate a recovery effort when your entire infrastructure is offline. At the end of the day, for these guys, the attack cost them about $5 million, and no ransom payment was made. So that's just $5 million of cash out the door on auxiliary expenses. There was some minor loss of non-critical workloads that the business just said, we're going to abandon those anyways. So it wasn't that we recovered absolutely everything. And then a significant investment after the attack was required to actually improve infrastructure and get things up to snuff. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is a 1,500 person logistics company. They have 10 locations, 270 VM workloads in a single data center. And to make this scenario unusual, the company had recently been acquired, and all of its legacy infrastructure was in a transition state. So employees had moved over to new ERP, and the data was in the process of being archived. Pre-attack network architecture had a new firewall. However, its license was expired and it was unpatched. They did run legacy antivirus, but they had a next-gen anti-exploit agent on all the endpoints. They didn't have a security operations center, nor did they have air-gapped backups. The new parent company had some of the stuff that they wanted to keep and had VM snapshots of some important workloads, but that was aside from the actual regular production backup infrastructure. So on event day, all servers that were left powered on, because some of the stuff was being decommissioned, was completely encrypted by NetWalker, and the ransom note asked for 250 Bitcoins, which is about $17 million in today's Canadian dollars. And also indicated that if you didn't pay it, not only would you not get the decryption key, but the NetWalker group would disclose the data on the dark web. So the response strategy was, again, a complete shutdown of the environment while we conducted a damage assessment. There wasn't actually a huge significant business impact because all the users of the ERP and all that other stuff had been migrated already to the new parent company's ERP. Legacy environment backups were destroyed. So because there was no air gap backup infrastructure, it was also encrypted. In this case, we didn't bother engaging with the attackers whatsoever, not even as a secondary response strategy or anything. We didn't even talk to them. We needed to assess what archival backups the parent company had actually already taken, and the decision was made to deploy those into a new isolated environment so that they could continue doing their data discovery and other work that they needed to do as part of the merger. Yeah, we scanned these boxes, make sure there's no dormant threats, and we continued to monitor the dark web for indicators of published data, including at the exact time they said they were going to publish it, and nothing ever showed up. So interesting to see that that was maybe an empty threat. So what happened here? The firewall was exploited using a known and internet accessible vulnerability. So basically it was picked up by a scanner or some sort of vulnerability sweeper, and it was just, do the remote code execution. The attacker gained access to direct VPN credentials. And this, I can't even believe people still do this stuff. So if you take nothing out of this, take this point here. The VPN credentials that were harvested through this firewall vulnerability were the same as a domain admin account. And basically now the attacker had legitimate VPN access and domain admin on the network and was able to do whatever they wanted. So they did about a day and a half of reconnaissance and then unloaded their NetWalker ransom payload. Looking back on the infrastructure after the attack, there were a ton of indicators of compromise. However, because this infrastructure was almost done being decommissioned, no one was really paying attention to it. Everybody was focused on the new production side. So key takeaways, lots of meetings with the parent company stakeholders, a lot of discussion around what's the actual value of some of the data that is potentially unrecoverable. What, if any, disclosure requirements are necessary? Takeaways for you guys on the call: make sure you're patching your firewalls. There was a ton of different CVEs about this particular vulnerability, and it had been out there for well over 6 months. And the vendor of that firewall had put out tons of different emails saying how critical it was to make sure you get this patch installed as soon as possible. Don't use the same credentials for VPN as domain admin. It's a bad problem. And you'll hear me talk about this a few more times yet today. Make sure you have proper air-gapped backups. And if you're not sure what air-gap means, then we'll drill into that at the end in the question period. But basically, you want to make sure that the backup storage area is not on the same network plane as your production infrastructure, nor is it as accessible via the same credentials. So in this case, because these guys had domain admin and the backup infrastructure was domain joined, they had access to the backups. Big problem. At the end of the day, the attack cost 500 grand. No ransom payment was made. There was a significant data loss, and the parent company just said, you know what, would have been nice to have that stuff, but it's not really critical. We'll just move on with life. No investment improvements, and the legacy infrastructure was finally retired a little ahead of schedule. Let's talk scenario 3. This is a 100-person construction company. They had 4 VM workloads in 1 server room. The architecture pre-attack, single production hypervisor. They had a disaster recovery hypervisor with daily replicas of their VMs going there. It's great. Local backup target. no offsite backups, and direct remote desktop exposed to internet. But they changed the ports from 3389, so they must be secure, right? No. They were not using VPN to get remote access. They were just RDPing into their machines from the internet. Next gen AV was used. Next gen anti-exploit was used. Well, that's odd. Why? How come they got attacked if they have all these latest and greatest things? No security operations center. So precursor, significant indicators of compromise for the 8 days pre-event, and a boatload of email warnings going to the chief operating officer's email in a folder called alerts, and not a single one of them were looked at, because once you move email to a folder, everybody knows it's gone forever. Going through all those emails, there were, all kinds of red flags that people were trying to chisel away at shutting off the next gen AV and related controls. And because they had unfettered access through RDP for 8 days, they were eventually able to shut off and disable the tamper protection and basically close down all the security controls on the hosts. Event day, the entire environment's offline. All the data is encrypted, all the replicas are encrypted, all the backups are encrypted, and a ransom note asking for a measly 5 Bitcoins, which at this moment is about $250,000. This was some time ago, so the price, I think at that point, was about 17,000 per coin. So still about 70 or 80 grand. It's not a non-significant amount. The response strategy, basically we assessed the damage and confirmed that indeed the backups are unrecoverable. There was no offsite backups. So we began, the only option was, we could set fire to the environment and rebuild and move on, or we can engage with the attacker and see what we get. So this is where it got interesting. We had to use Tor browser, which is a onion router browser that allows you to connect to their dark web host and actually have a direct chat with the attack group. And not surprisingly or surprisingly, it was a Russian guy who, there was some, lost in translation pieces, a little bit of broken English. So that you got to make sure you're clear, you're talking about the same stuff. Over the course of several hours, we were able to get it down to 0.45 of a Bitcoin, which was about $12,000 in Canadian dollars at that time. So we thought that was the hard part, was negotiating with terrorists. However, the actual hard part was getting them their money. There's a huge effort required to actually transact the Bitcoin payment. Unless you're already set up to do this and you're an active Bitcoin trader, there's a lot of effort into it. We had to set up a Bitcoin wallet. We had to plead with the wallet vendor. They had a 10-day restriction on deposits in excess of $500. So that wasn't going to work for us. Then we had to plead with the bank to allow an e-transfer larger than 10,000 to get money into the Bitcoin wallet. And then once that happened, then the Bitcoin wallet's vendors compliance department froze the account almost immediately. Then we had to actually execute the payment after we got that money released. And if anybody's seen a Bitcoin wallet, it's this huge GUID, basically. I don't even know what I think it's like 36 characters. It's a long string of numbers and letters. And if you even have if it's a capital E and you put a small e, that's a different wallet address, and you're going to wire the money to the wrong place. So we actually had 5 different people go character by character confirming we had the right address. And then we had to keep the attacker informed this whole time, because this financial process took 13 hours. So in scenario 1, there was some legal folks that got involved because the size of the attack was a lot bigger. And in their engagement letter, there was a thing that said they're going to take a 30% commission on any ransom payment that needed to be paid. I thought that was just adding insult to injury. You're going to pay $10 million, and then these guys are going to take a 30% or a $3 million rake on it. I thought that was outrageous. I still think it's outrageous. However, having gone through this ransom negotiation and payment process myself personally, I somewhat understand it. if you don't, you have to have the setup and the infrastructure and the cash on hand to be able to actually do this, and all the regulatory compliance that goes along with it. So it kind of makes sense, but geez, taking $3 million off a guy who's paying $10 million ransom seems a little bit outrageous. So we got the keys after 48 hours. Like, you can't even tell, I can't even tell you how long these 48 hours were. We pay the money and then there's nothing. I'm like, oh, guess we just lost ourselves 12 grand here. Finally, they came back and said, here's your EXE you can download, and it's a command line program, and the instructions are very, very minimal. So there's some interpolation you got to do. So the tool decrypts a few files and fails on the rest. We're like, oh, great, the tool's useless. Fantastic. Try it on some lab gear, same result. However, we do a closer inspection and it actually did decrypt everything, but it's new encrypted files and yet a new ransom note. So there's double encryption. And what double encryption is, somebody gets attacked, their stuff gets encrypted, and then someone else comes along almost immediately after and then re-encrypts stuff again. So we paid to get the keys and it decrypted things, but what was left was other decrypted files. So unbelievably, it was the same group that basically attacked these guys twice. And they actually agreed to build a new decrypt tool using the new ransom note hashes and sample files from the first encryption. But we had to wait another 36 hours of them saying, yeah, we'll get back to you with the tool. My guess was they're hot on the trail of destroying someone else's business. So they already had our money. We can wait. This was cool. We finally got the tool. We ran it, and it was like magic. You know, everything starts reappearing. VMDKs are unlocked, and we just basically remounted the VMs and started a scrubbing process and isolation and making sure everything was good to go. All in, the company was offline for a week while this occurred. Key takeaways here: it was a significant stressor for the owner of this business, as you might imagine. Pro tip: screaming at your banker, not an effective way to get what you want. Really tough to ask for things when they hang up on you. So it's very interesting, heated conversations get to sit in on. Speakerphone for the win. Exchange Online was an absolute lifesaver, as these guys were still able to communicate with their customers, and some of their project stuff was in email. So really they could somewhat hobble along, and that actually kind of limited the exposure or the costs. Never expose RDP to the internet for any reason at any time for anybody. There's just, you know, RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol, but nowadays it stands for Ransomware Delivery Protocol. So if you have RDP open to the internet, you should not listen to the rest of this presentation, hang up immediately and go and turn it off. You're just asking for it. Offsite backups. You need offsite backups, and you also need to test them and air gap your backup infrastructure. I've said it in the last couple of scenarios, you absolutely need to be doing this. If they had this, then okay, you had RDP open, that's bad. Okay, your backups are encrypted, that's horrible. But if you had a proper air gapped offsite infrastructure, okay, we recover from backup and you move on. Also, pro tip here, if you do end up doing attacker negotiations, keep that Tor window open. It's this attack specific link that you need. So if you accidentally close it and you've already started some of the recovery, it's impossible to get back in touch with the attacker under the session ID that you've already paid them for. So even if you were to stumble across their chat window, it would be a new session ID for them and they think that you're somebody else. Just keep that Tor window open until things are 100% said and done. At the end of the day here, for these guys, the cost of the attack was about 150 grand. That did include the $12,000 ransom payment. But because they were able to kind of keep on with some of their work, their actual costs weren't as severe as some of the other people. There was an investment required as well to continue improving the infrastructure. So some overall themes. A security operations center is an absolute must. In every single one of these examples, it was because nobody was watching and nobody was paying attention to alerts. Almost all of these could have been avoided if somebody had been actioning an alert the second the problem started. Now, even for smaller businesses, you can get a security operations center. There's tons of managed threat response services that are on the market where you have 24/7 security operations staff watching your log aggregation devices, watching traffic on the network, can actually stop things if things start going in the wrong direction. They can limit the damage and alert you at 2 in the morning if something's going on. Next gen anti-exploit is an absolute must. The traditional antivirus just simply doesn't work. I like to use an analogy of to explain this as having an electronics store, and a traditional antivirus agent is basically like having a security guard at the door for that electronics store with a book of mug shots of known criminals who rob electronics stores. And as people come in and out of the store, they look at the book, look at the guy's face. Yeah, no, you're good to go. Anti-exploit uses behavioral-based AI to look for malicious behavior. So it doesn't matter whether the guy's in the book of mugshots or not. Backing up a pickup truck and loading it full of big screens is malicious behavior. I'm going to stop that action based on that action alone, mugshot notwithstanding. So that's absolutely critical. And again, I'll say it one more time, proper air gap backups. If your backup infrastructure is domain joined, it should be domain joined. It should be on a separate network plane. So if you don't have isolation architecture in your environment, now's the time to do it. I shouldn't be able to route traffic directly from your production data network to your backup infrastructure. You should use administrative network and a backup network to connect into your hypervisors through the back end and pull backups that way. Make sure then also your offsites aren't traversable through a VPN, and basically just look at ways that once you're on that production network, can I easily get over to your backup plane and start encrypting your backups? So that is the long and the short of this. We got some time left here for some questions. See who's answered. John asks, was the RCMP involved? In a few cases, yes, RCMP was involved. In scenario 1, they were involved, and in scenario 3, the Winnipeg Police Commercial Crimes Unit was involved, and those guys were fairly useless, to be frank. They're like, what is ransomware? And they kind of just got in the way a little bit. And they're like, well, why would they choose this company to attack? I'm like, it's just luck of the draw, really. And so I offered to do this same presentation to the police, and they haven't called me. Did the company perform an analysis on costs, lost business? Yes. So those figures were rounded numbers based on the results of that. And to the extent that I'm aware of those results, that's where the cost of the attack came from. Are air gap backups effectively the same as immutable backups, or are there key differences to keep in mind? Immutable backups is it's basically, once you've written the backup, you can't change the data. So that's what that means. So if an attacker was able to access it and encrypt it, it wouldn't work. It's a good thing to do. I would argue that you should go that step further and make sure that nobody from the production data network has access to your backup infrastructure at all. How do you know if your RDP is open to the internet? Well, you can scan your IP range using like Shodan or something like that, or Nessus or one of those tools. Shoot me an email and I can send you some more details on how you would want to do that. Or if you just are going to remote desktop client and typing in remoteoffice.clientname.com and click connect, and then that's RDP, and it's not on a VPN. Any other questions? John asks, what time was Informanix called in? In all of these scenarios, we were called in on event day. Were these companies performing routine vulnerability scans? No. No, they were not. Can you talk a bit more about offline backups? Take too long to restore, right? Yeah, so that's a great question, because getting backups offsite to tape, great. They are air gapped by their very nature. If they're sitting in a drawer or a vault, they can't be touched. However, as we saw in scenario 1, make sure you're considering the length of restoration. So that is a long way to restore on a tape. There are faster ways to do that. We live in a golden age of infrastructure possibilities. You can get air gap backups going to a cloud provider if you're on-prem. Even if you're on a cloud provider, you can get them going to a different cloud provider in an air gapped fashion, and really get yourself a awesome infrastructure. And the cost for that is a lot less than it would be even 5 years ago. And some of the architecture decisions you can make today are a lot better than what it would be 5 years ago as well. So it's a new ball game nowadays. How common is no SOC? Almost no one has a SOC. The large companies have it. In the small business arena, Informanix clients have it, because we started putting it in as we saw the scenario 1. We made the decision to put in a managed threat response service for all of our customers that are under full management. But it's still a fairly new offering. And a lot of people hear the term security operations center. It sounds complicated and expensive, and they immediately go down the path of thinking you need like 5 or 10 guys that are $200,000 a year people. Yeah, it's not necessarily that now. You can get access to SOC type services at a fairly aggressive price point, and really take a load off in terms of risk exposure, and even just your own peace of mind having that happening in the background. Examples of next gen endpoint protection. There's Carbon Black, Sentinel-1, and Sophos Intercept X are what I would consider to be the big 3. Other vendors are playing catch up, and over the last 12 to 18 months, there's been pretty significant shift in the security vendor landscape. Everybody is getting into this game. So if you're not there yet with your current vendor, there's a good chance that you could be in the near future. And most of these are double agents. And what I mean by that is they'll run the traditional antivirus client and the next gen client at the same time. There's still value in having the traditional AV agent. Some of them are integrated. So one product does traditional AV and anti-exploit. Some of them are anti-exploit overlays on top of a traditional AV, and you can actually have 2 different vendors doing that. Can you speak to the importance of end user training, such as phishing campaign? Good point. I didn't actually mention that at all. If you can reduce this stuff coming in, especially the email attack vector, I think the phishing training is a really good way to expose people to the types of threats that are out there and getting them to think differently about emails. However, in the one environment, there was a lot of business spreadsheets that did require people to enable macros. So that problem was actually made even worse because people were used to opening up documents and enabling macros as a regular course of business. So definitely see if you can get rid of those macro enabled spreadsheets if you're using them as an actual business application. Do phishing training at least quarterly with your staff, and make sure you do employee onboarding training, talking to them about the types of threats that are out there, and really just to stop and think about things. I find that those banners that people are putting on emails, it says this email is not from such and such company, and make sure you, I would almost say turn that off. It's really useless because everybody just glosses over it. And worse yet, in the last 2 months, we've seen attack examples where people have impersonated that banner ad and say that this email has been checked by client name security services and has been deemed safe. So if people even are paying attention to those email header banners, now attackers are using those banners against you to trick your users into thinking that you've actually analyzed it and deemed the link to be safe. So it could actually be worse. Did these companies disclose they were impacted by ransomware to their business partners? As in all cases, there was a disclosure, yes. There are some that were legally required to disclose and others that just did it as a courtesy. To the best of my knowledge, there wasn't any actual, no, they didn't lose business as a result of this. In 2 of the situations, the client actually took it upon themselves to invite their own customers to hear the story about what happened and share the word on how to not have it happen to their people they do business with. So there was kind of a positive spin put on that. If you have a question, just throw it in the Q&A chat here. I can see them and I'll read them out. I think I've got everything that's been asked so far. We'll stay on for a few more minutes. For those who don't have questions, thanks a lot for attending. Hopefully you've gotten something out of this. Ideally, we don't have to see you in a disaster. And Val, you got your hand up.
One AXA insurance recently stated that they were no longer going to pay ransom, that they would help with the issue, but they weren't going to pay ransom. And then promptly were attacked by ransomware. And I'm just curious, do you think that there will be a real change in insurance companies paying ransom?
I'm not sure. And, my personal opinion is the way to solve this is to make the payment of ransom illegal in Canada and the US. And then companies will take that probably more seriously. And if you eliminate the method of which to actually pay ransom, you might see a reduction in the amount of attacks that are occurring because people know that their victims are legally not able to give them the money.
Yeah.
Probably more likely the problem's going to get worse before it gets better. There is a significant amount of companies that aren't running any of the advanced tools. They're not using a security operations center. They're not looking at logs even. Tons of people with old infrastructure out there, unpatched firewalls, RDP on the internet. Like, the list goes on and on. There's so much out there that I think there's going to be more before it starts quieting down. Okay, well, I guess, Val, maybe we'll close it off here. If
Okay.
folks want to ask a question offline, my contact info is on the screen.
Okay, we'll leave that up there.
Have a chat.
We'll leave your contact information up there for a few minutes, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope that you take this to heart, and that goes for directors and anyone that works for any company, because our infrastructure is now all information technology related. So anyway, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Kyle. It was a great presentation and very, very valuable. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.